I gave myself to 8 different men and even convinced my husband to open our marriage. I unknowingly contracted a disease and passed it to my lovers. When my videos and test results were leaked, I lost everything. When I remember the beginning, it's hard to believe that the same woman writing these words is the same one who once thought she was living a fairy tale. I was Lucia, 38 years old, a stretching and body conditioning instructor at a small studio in downtown Guadalajara. I've always been vain, energetic, one of those people who gets up early, has coffee watching the sunrise, and believes that life, somehow, rewards those who are dedicated. And for a long time I thought it had rewarded me. I was married to Daniel, a sweet, polite, and hardworking man. He was a software engineer, and even with the world of codes and screens around him, he had that calm look of someone who still knew what it was to live outside of machines. Our marriage was the picture of stability, or at least that's how everyone saw it. We had a beautiful house in Zapopan, 2 dogs, vacation trips, and quiet dinners on Friday nights. People said we were the couple that always seemed happy, and in a way we were. At first, Daniel made me laugh at everything, and I loved how he lost his composure when he tried to cook. It was simple, but it was love. A love that was enough for me for a long time. But the problem with a stable love is that it can slowly become lukewarm and nobody notices when it starts. That's what happened to us. One day I woke up and realized he hadn't looked at me the same way in months, that our conversations were limited to how was work. Did you buy bread and will it rain tomorrow? The laughter faded, the caresses disappeared, and silence began to fill the space between the walls. I tried to rekindle something. I prepared dinners, bought new clothes, created moments for us to be alone, but he seemed distant, tired. Daniel said it was work stress, deadlines, clients. And I believed him because it was easier to blame exhaustion than to admit we were losing each other. The nights grew long and the room grew cold. I tossed and turned in bed feeling an abyss between us, and it was in that abyss that I began to lose myself. I started looking outside for what I couldn't find inside. I don't mean another man, not yet. I mean glances, little bits of attention, feeling alive. The new gym instructor praised my performance. A client smiled too much. A friend sent me affectionate messages. Innocent things, but they awoke something I hadn't felt in a long time, the pleasure of being noticed. I wasn't looking for love or sex, at least not at that moment. What I was looking for was a reflection. I wanted to see myself through the eyes of someone who still saw me. Daniel wasn't cruel. He never raised his voice at me. He never treated me badly, and maybe that was part of the problem. His indifference was too silent for me to be able to scream. Neither of us had the courage to say the marriage was dying. And so we carried on, smiling at family dinners, posting happy photos, making plans that no longer had any weight, but deep down I felt a crack opening up. It was on a work trip with Daniel that I realized how alone I was. He was gone for 15 days, and I spent the nights tossing and turning in bed, unable to sleep, as the house was too big for one person. In this solitude, I began to talk more with a new student at the studio, a guy named Diego, 10 years younger, full of energy and with a knack for compliments. I laughed at his jokes like I hadn't laughed at Daniel's in a long time, and every time he looked at me something inside me transformed. At first, I told myself it was just friendship, but the line between friendship and desire is much thinner than it seems. When Daniel returned, I was a different person. He hugged me, brought me a necklace as a gift, and I received it with a smile that wasn't sincere because for the first time I was lying. Not with words, not yet, but with intentions. The seed of betrayal was already planted, and I pretended not to see it sprout. That night, I watched him sleep and wondered when I stopped loving him the same way. And even more so, when I stopped loving myself enough to be honest. I didn't know it yet, but that was the beginning of the end. The days following Daniel's trip were a distorted reflection of my own conscience. I woke up early, had coffee with trembling hands, and tried to pretend that life was going on at the same pace, but everything had already changed. Diego would show up at the studio every morning, always with that smile of someone who seemed to understand the effect he had on me. It was impossible to ignore him. There was something in his gaze, a mix of curiosity and boldness that reminded me I was still a woman, that my body could still arouse interest, even if my heart was trapped in a marriage that no longer suited me. We started talking after class about unimportant things, movies, travel, food, the city's traffic. I'd tell him I was married and he'd laugh, saying Daniel must be a lucky man. I'd respond with a hidden smile, trying to close the subject, but deep down I liked the idea of being the lucky woman for someone who no longer saw me that way. Over time, the conversations grew longer, the glances lingered. One day, when everyone had left, he helped me put away the mats, and as he picked up the last one, our hands touched. It was brief, but enough to ignite something I thought was dead. I spent the whole weekend thinking about that touch. Guilt gnawed at me, but curiosity won. I wanted to know how far it would go if I let it. It was a constant struggle between I can't and just this once. On Monday, I went to work determined to keep my distance. But a single look was enough to break all those promises. He was waiting for me in the lobby with a coffee as if he already knew what I needed. "You look tired," he said, trying to hide my nervousness. "Maybe a little," I replied. He took a step closer, and it was with that step that everything began to fall apart. After class, he insisted on walking me to my car. We talked in the parking lot, and time seemed to pass differently. The wind was warm, the sun was setting, and for an instant I forgot everything. My husband, the routine, morality. He looked me in the eyes and said in a low voice, "I think about you more than I should." I was speechless. My body reacted before my mind. The kiss came like a lightning bolt, fast, inevitable, and by the time I realized it, it was already too late. I tasted coffee, guilt, something forbidden and at the same time irresistible. I returned home in a daze. Daniel was waiting for me with dinner ready, and I could barely look him in the eye. He talked, he smiled. He asked me how my day had been, but it all sounded distant, as if I were watching him from the outside. When he leaned in to kiss me, I instinctively pulled back. He noticed, of course, but said nothing. Maybe he thought I was tired, maybe he preferred not to know. And I, a coward, let the silence do the dirty work for me. In the following days, I tried to stay away from Diego, but every time he got close, my heart raced. And as in any story that begins with a lie, one slip leads to another. Without realizing it, we were exchanging messages at all hours, talking late into the night, sending each other photos, smiles, and desires. I told myself it was just a phase, that it would end soon, that it was just a way to escape the loneliness, but any excuse seems plausible when all you want is to feel. The first time we slept together happened almost without words. One Saturday afternoon, after class, the studio was empty, the sound of rain hitting the windows, the smell of sweat and incense mixed together. He pulled me by the waist and kissed me with the haste of someone who knows they're doing something wrong. I trembled not just with desire, but with fear. Fear of being discovered, fear of losing myself. But when the touch turned to skin and guilt to pleasure, everything disappeared. Only the body, the heat, and the feeling of being alive again remained. Afterwards, I lay staring at the ceiling with a racing heart and a shattered soul. He was sleeping, and I thought of Daniel. I thought about how much he trusted me, how at that very moment he could have been buying dinner or washing the car without knowing what was happening to me. Shame consumed me completely. But still, the next day I went back, and the day after too. It was like a drug. The more I tried to stop, the more I needed it. Daniel began to notice the distance. He asked me if I was okay, if something was wrong. I told him it was work, tiredness. He believed me, and each new lie pushed me further away from him and further away from myself. At that moment, I still believed I had the situation under control, that I could have both worlds, the stable husband and the passionate lover, but what I didn't realize was that I no longer controlled anything. Betrayal, once started, takes root, and mine were already spreading inside, suffocating what love was left. Betrayal has a specific sound. The sound of your heart beating uncontrollably every time your phone vibrates. I've come to recognize this sound as part of my day. It was a warning, a reminder of what I was hiding, an echo of what I had become. At first, Diego and I were like two teenagers discovering something forbidden. We'd meet at the most unexpected times, between classes, in the parking lot, in cheap motels near Lopez Mateos Avenue. I lived in constant suspense, making up excuses for every absence, every deleted message, every different perfume. And no matter how much guilt crushed me afterwards, one look from him was enough to make everything I had promised myself disappear. As the months went by, what was once exciting became routine. I no longer felt nervous, I felt used to it. It scared me to realize how easy it is to normalize mistakes when they're repeated many times. I'd wake up, make coffee for Daniel, kiss him on the forehead, and go to work, knowing that in a matter of hours I'd be in another man's arms. The love, the respect, the loyalty, everything we once swore to each other was now just a distant memory. And yet, I kept saying I loved my husband. A lie repeated so many times it began to sound true. My relationship with Daniel became cold and mechanical. He'd talk to me, but it felt like he was talking to a shadow. I no longer really listened to him. When he talked about his work problems, my mind would wander. When he tried to get close, I'd pull away, and every time he pulled away, I'd use it as a justification to keep doing what I was doing. It was as if guilt needed a reason to exist, and I fed it with excuses. If he loved me, I wouldn't need to look outside. If he were more present, I wouldn't feel so lonely. These phrases became my shield against the mirror, but the mirror is cruel. It doesn't accept excuses. And every night, when I looked at myself, I saw the same empty gaze. I tried to convince myself there was still love between us, but it was a lie. Daniel deserved a faithful wife, and I was no longer one. He deserved the truth, and I lived in disguise. Diego, in turn, began to change. What had been an intense passion became habitual. He became more distant, less present. Sometimes he'd disappear for days, and when he returned, I'd receive him as if he were air. It was in this imbalance that I realized how addicted I was to that feeling of being desired. It wasn't about him, it was about me. I needed that adrenaline rush because without it my life felt colorless. Until one day Diego simply disappeared without a message, without an explanation. I waited a week, then two. When I finally saw him again, he was with another woman at the gym, young, handsome, self-assured. I smiled on the outside and fell apart on the inside. It was in that moment that I realized how pathetic I had become. A married woman hiding an affair that no longer existed, trying to pretend she still had control. I went home and found Daniel cooking. He looked at me and smiled with that serene smile that had once captivated me. "I bought your favorite wine," he said. I felt like crying. For a moment, I wanted to confess everything to him. I wanted to kneel down and tell every lie, every encounter, every absence. But cowardice won again. I sat at the table and ate in silence, with the metallic taste of shame in my mouth. The following weeks were a blur. I tried to act normal, but I felt a void inside me. Without Diego, I realized how destroyed my marriage was. I no longer had a lover, a husband, or an identity. I was just a woman divided between remorse and emptiness. And it was in that emptiness that the idea that would change everything was born, the idea that would seal my fate forever. Daniel began to make a genuine effort to bring us closer. He wanted to travel, go out to dinner, talk. But by then I was already too emotionally distant. I'd look at him and see a stranger. His touch made me uncomfortable, and every attempt at affection was like a vivid reminder of the guilt I carried. And yet, something inside me insisted on justifying myself. Maybe if I told the truth he'd never forgive me, so it's better to keep pretending. But the truth always finds a way to come out, sometimes with words, sometimes with gestures. In my case, it came out in silence, in the empty gaze, in the absence of affection, in the growing distance. Daniel noticed it, and so did I, but neither of us had the courage to admit it. And it was precisely in that silence that the marriage truly began to die, not because of a physical betrayal, but because of an emotional betrayal that no longer needed a lover to exist. I didn't know it yet, but what came next would show me that nothing dies in peace. Sometimes fate needs chaos to end what cowardice keeps alive. There comes a time when a lie becomes too heavy. It's like a glass that fills drop by drop until the slightest movement makes it overflow. For me, that movement came one ordinary night, One of those that seem the same as any other, but that reveal themselves to be decisive when you look back. Daniel and I were having dinner. The sound of the television filled the silence between us. He looked at me and asked with the calm of someone who has carried a weight for a long time. "Lucia, do you still love me?" It was 6 simple words, but each one cut like a blade. It took me a while to answer. The fork was trembling in my hand. He waited patiently, and I felt that if I lied one more time, something inside me would die completely. "I love you," I mumbled. But my voice was low, almost a confession of guilt. He sighed, looked away, and said, "Because I don't recognize you anymore." Those words hit me harder than any shout. For the first time I realized that Daniel knew, maybe not the details, but something inside him already understood that there was someone else between us. And it was there, at that table, between a plate of rice and the weight of silence, that I decided to tell the truth. I waited for the right moment, or what I thought was the right moment. 3 days later, on a cold morning, I sat with him in the living room. The half-drawn curtains let in the faint sunlight, and I felt my heart pounding. "Daniel, I have to tell you something." He looked at me seriously. "I don't want you to hate me," I continued with sweaty palms. "But I cheated on you." The sentence came out dry, raw, blunt. The air seemed to disappear from the room. Daniel was silent for long seconds, staring at me as if trying to understand what he had just heard. "With whom?" he asked in a hoarse voice. I hesitated, but I answered. I told him about Diego, about the classes, the meetings, the lies, about everything. Every word was a hard blow for me. He stood up slowly, walked to the window, and looked out. The silence was so intense I could hear the clock ticking. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and restrained. "You destroyed what we had, Lucia. I always thought if something destroyed us it would be time, not you." Those words pierced me. He didn't scream, he didn't break anything, he didn't insult me, he simply walked away, and that calm hurt more than any fury. In the following days, the house became a minefield. Daniel slept in the guest room, avoided long conversations, and left for work early. I tried to talk, to explain, to apologize, but it all seemed useless. There was something irreparable between us, and what hurt me the most was knowing he still loved me, but he no longer trusted me. Love can survive pain, but not distrust. After a week of this suffocating silence, I made a rash decision, or perhaps a desperate one. I thought that if infidelity were a mutual decision, maybe it could cleanse the guilt. So at the height of the confusion I said, maybe we could try something different, open the marriage. Daniel laughed in disbelief. "Are you serious?" he asked with a tone that mixed anger and amazement. "Yes," I replied. "I don't want to lose you, but maybe we need freedom." He looked at me as if he no longer recognized the person in front of him. "Freedom," he repeated, "or an excuse to keep doing what you want." I didn't know what to say. I talked about freedom, but it was cowardice. I wanted to justify my mistakes with modernity, disguise my guilt with a new philosophy. But Daniel, even hurt, remained lucid. "If that's what you want," he said, "do it, but don't expect me to be the same afterwards." And he wasn't. In the following days, he accepted the idea, not out of desire, but out of resignation. And it was with this concession that our marriage became a lawless kingdom. We began to live by what I called a pact of transparency. Each of us could get involved with whomever we wanted, as long as it was with respect and sincerity. But sincerity doesn't exist where there's an open wound. It was an attempt to rebuild with the pieces still sharp. Daniel started going out more and coming home late. I pretended I didn't care, and little by little what was left between us became mere appearances. We slept under the same roof, but we were strangers sharing a space. However, I convinced myself it was a new stage, a mature freedom, a modern new beginning. And for the first time I felt a strange euphoria. I could desire without guilt, live without hiding. But what I didn't realize was that by trying to save my marriage from ruin, I was leading it to the abyss. Because freedom, when it's born from betrayal, is never liberation. It's just the most elegant way to keep destroying yourself. The decision to open our marriage was a point of no return. The moment Daniel agreed, something inside us broke irreversibly. I remember the first night after that conversation. The silence felt alive, dense, as if every corner of the house had heard our decision. Neither of us slept. We stayed in separate rooms, but awake, each trying to understand if this was the end or a pathetic attempt to postpone the inevitable. I told myself we were being mature, brave, different, when in reality we were just masking the pain. In the following days, Daniel began to feign an artificial calm. He said everything was fine, that he understood my point of view, that he also wanted to experience this new stage. I knew it was a lie. He accepted it because he loved me, but that love was already bleeding. And ironically, it was this false acceptance that gave me the courage to move forward. It was as if guilt had suddenly been given permission to transform into desire. I started chatting with new people, men from dating apps, acquaintances from the gym, even former students who started writing to me again. At first, I felt euphoric, as if I had regained control of my life. I'd leave the house with a racing heart, making up banal excuses for Daniel, an extra class, a meeting with friends, a work meeting. And he never questioned it. Sometimes I'd catch him looking at me in silence, with a look that mixed pity and tiredness. My first relationship after Diego was with a physical therapist named Javier. He was in his late 40s, separated, and had a way of talking that made me feel important. He wasn't handsome like Diego, but there was something about him that made me let my guard down. With him, I didn't feel guilt, and maybe that was the most dangerous thing. We started seeing each other almost every week, and soon my life revolved around these encounters. I'd come home exhausted, smelling of another man, and wonder if Daniel had noticed. Of course he had, but he never said anything. And this lack of confrontation gave me more freedom than I deserved. The open phase of our marriage began to spread like a stain. Daniel started going out too. At first I thought it was a bluff, but soon I realized it was real. He met a woman named Carla, an architect, and began to see her frequently. When I realized it, something inside me stirred. The irony was cruel. I had asked for freedom, but I wasn't ready to deal with his. For the first time I felt jealousy of a man I had pushed into the arms of another. I tried to hide it, but my anger was obvious. I'd ask him about her, feigning disinterest, and he'd respond with an almost provocative calm. "She's interesting, different," he'd say. And every time I heard her name it was like a needle piercing my chest. I began to understand what I had done. What I had called freedom was actually a way to escape rejection. And now, seeing him happy with someone else, I realized that maybe I had never lost my love for him. I had just hurt him too much to recognize it. But instead of stopping, of trying to rebuild myself, I sank even deeper. It was as if the pain propelled me. The more Daniel distanced himself, the more I sought other bodies, other distractions. I met a businessman at a cafe, a female physical therapy client who fell in love with me, a visiting instructor at the studio. In a few months, I had been with 3 different men, and each one made me feel alive for a few hours and empty for weeks. It was a vicious cycle: pleasure, guilt, regret, and then all over again. Daniel started going out more often. He no longer told me anything. He'd come back late, smelling of someone else's perfume, and every time this happened, I felt the bitter taste of my own poison. Still, I kept pretending everything was fine, that the arrangement was working. It's amazing how far we can go when pride doesn't allow us to admit our mistake. One day, in a desperate attempt to feel desired again, I accepted an invitation from a couple I met online. I told myself it was just curiosity, that I wanted to experiment with limits, but the truth is I just wanted to escape myself. That night was the beginning of a spiral that would consume me completely. From that moment on, I lost count of the times I crossed the line between pleasure and self-destruction. I came home late with my soul in pieces. Daniel was in the living room sitting on the sofa, watching the turned-off television. When I walked in, he simply asked, "Was it worth it?" I didn't know what to say. He got up, walked past me without another word, and went to sleep. And it was in that silence that I realized our marriage was over. What was left was just a cohabitation fueled by guilt, desire, and resentment. From then on, everything began to fall apart. I no longer knew who I was. And when we lose our sense of identity, it's only a matter of time before we also lose everything around us. I don't know exactly when I stopped counting. Maybe it was after the fourth or fifth man. At first, I was still trying to justify every encounter, every exchanged message, every night out, but then the justifications became unnecessary. I was no longer looking for pleasure, much less love. I was looking for oblivion. I wanted to erase the bitter taste of rejection, of guilt, of the emptiness that Daniel's silence left at home. Each new body was a brief anesthesia, a poorly closed patch on a wound that never healed. The second one after Javier was a man named Ernesto, a personal trainer from another gym. He looked at me with a kind of desire that made me feel in control. With him, I wasn't the unfaithful wife or the lost woman. I was just a fantasy. And maybe that's what attracted me, being desired without having to feign love. Then came others, a divorced dentist, a friend's colleague, a foreigner living temporarily in the city. None of them knew who I really was, and I no longer knew either. Meanwhile, Daniel and I barely spoke. Our lives became parallel, linked only by papers and memories. Sometimes he'd sleep out and I'd pretend not to notice. Other times it was me who didn't come home, and he didn't even ask. It was as if we had both given up pretending there was anything to save. Still, separation was never officially mentioned. I think we were trapped by fear of loneliness, of judgment, of a definitive end. It was during this time that I met Miguel, a charming older businessman with a calm voice and a patience that unnerved me. He treated me with an affection that seemed genuine. With him I felt something different, not love, but a kind of comfort, a respite from the chaos. He'd invite me to discreet dinners, short trips, always with affection and discretion. For the first time in a long time I felt valued, but what seemed like a refuge soon became another prison. Miguel was possessive. He began to want to know where I was, with whom, at what time. He'd call late, check messages, and since I was already lying to everyone, lying to another one seemed natural. But he found out, I don't know how, that I was still married. When that happened, his tenderness melted like wet paper. He said I was an imposter, that women like me destroyed families. I tried to explain, but he disappeared. And just when I thought the worst part was losing another piece of myself, I discovered I could still fall further. Shortly after, I began to feel strange pains, a discomfort I couldn't ignore. I went to the doctor, trying to convince myself it was something simple. The diagnosis was like a punch, a silent and advanced sexually transmitted infection. I took the prescription and the instructions and left the office trembling. I had no idea when or from whom I had contracted it. Shame paralyzed me. I tried to hide it, to manage it myself, to pretend everything was fine, but without realizing it, I continued to see some of the men I had been with before. And without knowing it, I spread what I was carrying inside. A few weeks later, the messages started. First one, then another. Furious and scared men said I had infected them. One threatened me, another spread rumors. It was the beginning of a storm I couldn't contain. In a matter of days, part of the city seemed to find out. People whispered and looked on with disapproval. My coworkers began to withdraw. Students at the studio stopped coming. My reputation, already fragile, began to crumble publicly. Daniel, of course, found out. I don't know if it was rumors or a direct message. Maybe someone made sure to tell him. I remember the night he came home with his eyes full of rage and contempt. Is it true? He asked, holding up his phone as if it were evidence of a crime. I cried, I begged, I tried to explain that I didn't know, that I never wanted to hurt anyone, but words were worthless. You destroy everything you touch, he said before walking out the door and never coming back. That night I sat on the living room floor, surrounded by silence. It was then that I realized I had lost everything. Not just my marriage, but my dignity, my respect, my identity. The faces blurred in my memories. Javier, Ernesto, Miguel, the others whose names no longer mattered. The pleasure that once made me feel alive now made me feel dead inside. In the following days I received more messages, some threatening, others derogatory, until photos and shortly after videos began to circulate. I didn't know I had been recorded. Men I had been with, without my consent, had kept records. And now everything was being spread, shared, and commented on. My name, my body, my shame, all exposed. Social media became a battlefield. Fake profiles, anonymous messages, insults, sick, slut, shameful. And I, powerless, watched it all unfold. Every notification was a new blow. I tried to delete it, to report it, but it was useless. When a woman's reputation becomes a public spectacle, there's no one to defend her. And still, I was alive. On the outside. Inside, there was almost nothing left. The following weeks were a slow hell. I woke up every day with a racing heart, as if I were being punished for a crime. The worst part was that in a way I was already being punished, and publicly. The messages were incessant. Insults, threats, provocations. The men laughed at me in groups. The women insulted me in comments. People I didn't know talked about my life as if they knew me. Everything I was, everything I had lived, had been reduced to a grotesque caricature. The videos began to circulate on forums, social media, and even adult websites. I didn't know how they got there, but there they were, my face, my body, my naked shame, reproduced and shared as if it were entertainment. The cruelest part was realizing that many of those videos had been recorded without my consent. Hidden cameras, angles I had never noticed. The betrayal I had committed against Daniel seemed to be turning against me on a multiplied scale. I, who had so feared being discovered, was now completely exposed. The news spread through Guadalajara like a plague. The name Lucia became synonymous with scandal. Students at the studio began to cancel classes en masse. Some sent polite messages saying they preferred to withdraw for personal reasons. Others were more direct. I don't want a teacher who gets involved with her own clients. A few days later, the studio owner called me for a chat. Her gaze was cold and uncomfortable. She said that due to the circumstances, it would be better if I took a leave of absence for an indefinite period. At that moment, I knew I was fired. I went home carrying my bag with my work materials and the feeling that the floor had disappeared. Daniel no longer lived there. The walls seemed larger, empty, an echo of my own silence. My parents, who had always been strict, found out online. My mother called me crying, asking if it was true. My father wouldn't speak to me. When he finally answered, he simply said, "You have disgraced our name." He hung up without letting me respond. He never contacted me again. I became an outcast, a figure everyone recognized, but no one wanted to get close to. I went to the supermarket and noticed the stares. The cashier avoided looking me in the eye. A neighbor ignored me in the hallway. Even the children who used to greet me now whispered as they passed. It was as if the word shame had been branded on my face. And the worst part was that deep down I believed I deserved it. I began to avoid leaving the house. The curtains were always drawn, the phone always on silent. I spent entire days lying down, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand how I had gotten there. I remembered every decision, every lie, every excuse, and saw how it all fit together in an inevitable sequence of destruction. What started as a search for affection ended in public humiliation. I was no longer a woman. I was a horror story being repeated in WhatsApp groups. The threats intensified. Some of the men I had been with, perhaps out of fear or shame, began to spread the word that I had deceived everyone, that I knew about the disease and had spread it on purpose. A convenient, cruel, and easily believable lie. I received messages saying I should be arrested. Others sent me photos of myself with insults written on them. One day I found graffiti on the wall near my house. Lucia, the sick one. The feeling was of constant suffocation. I couldn't eat, sleep, or breathe properly. Every sound made me tremble. I'd look out the window terrified of seeing cameras, faces, or pointing fingers. My body trembled constantly and tears would fall without warning. I tried to delete my social media accounts, but someone always created new profiles with my name, my photos, my quotes. It was like fighting a faceless monster that multiplied with every attempt at defense. The days became long and blurry. I lost track of time. Sometimes I'd wake up in the afternoon, other times at dawn. My body was weakening, my mind was crumbling, and just when I thought I had nothing left to lose, I received an anonymous letter. Inside were printed copies of my photos, taken from the videos, and a handwritten message: "You deserve everything that's happening to you." That day I understood it was no longer about public shame. It was a punishment the world imposed on me, but that I had initiated myself. The weight of guilt turned into desperation, and desperation into a desire to disappear. I no longer wanted to clear my name. I just wanted to sleep and never wake up. Deep down I knew there were still ways out: therapy, reporting it, help. But when the body and mind are already shattered, hope is a luxury that pain doesn't allow. And that's how the idea began to mature silently, like a promise of peace. Maybe the only way to end it all was to end myself. The night I decided to die wasn't marked by anything grand. No particular tragedy, no unexpected event. It was just the accumulation, the sum of 1,000 small fragments that cut me inside day after day, until the body and soul grew tired of bleeding. I remember waking up late, with the light filtering through the cracks in the curtains and feeling a strange, almost absolute silence. Outside, the city was still alive. Cars, voices, distant laughter. But inside, everything was calm. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror and barely recognized my reflection. Sunken eyes, chapped lips, disheveled hair. The woman who once took pride in her strength now looked like a ghost. And in that moment, a sentence crossed my mind with cold clarity. No one will miss it. I spent the rest of the day wandering around the house. The clock ticked on. Each tick-tock a reminder that I no longer belonged. The messages on my phone wouldn't stop coming: curses, accusations, laughter. I wouldn't know anymore. I just let them vibrate as if accepting a punishment. In the evening, I began to gather a few things: old photos, notes Daniel had written to me in the early years of our marriage, a bracelet I wore on our honeymoon in Puerto Vallarta. I put it all in a box and left it on the bed. I looked at it and realized how cruel life can be. The love that was once a promise was now a memory of ruin. As night fell, I made a simple, almost calm decision. I opened the medicine cabinet and gathered everything I could find: tranquilizers, painkillers, antidepressants. I took a handful with a glass of wine. I didn't cry, I didn't tremble, I didn't hesitate, I just swallowed. Like someone completing a task. I waited for a few minutes, sitting on the living room floor, feeling the numbness wash over me. My mind began to calm down and a strange peace came over me. For an instant I thought I had finally found the silence I was looking for, but the body has a cruel way of resisting. I felt nauseous, my vision blurred, and a warmth flooded my chest. I tried to get up, but my legs wouldn't obey. I staggered to the stairs and started to climb without knowing why. Maybe I was looking for height, maybe a final act of desperation. When I reached the top, I looked down the long, empty hallway and, without thinking, I let my body give way. I only remember the dull, distant sound of the impact. Then, nothing. I woke up 3 days later in the hospital, surrounded by tubes, wires, and the constant hum of machines. The light was too white, too cold. I tried to move my arm, but it didn't respond. I tried to speak, but my voice came out slurred and distorted. I panicked. A nurse ran to me, took my hand, and said, in a soft, almost compassionate tone, "Calm down, Lucia, you've had an accident. You're alive, but you need to rest." The words "alive" sounded like irony. In the following hours, everything came back together. I found out I had hit my head during the fall and suffered a serious trauma. The excess medication and lack of oxygen during the faint had caused me to have a stroke. The final diagnosis: partial paralysis on the left side of my body, speech problems, and an uncertain recovery. I heard it like a sentence. I was alive, but maimed, not just physically, but in my very essence. In the following days I received no visitors, none, not family, not friends, not even Daniel. The nurses came and went, some looking at me with compassion, others with a kind of silent contempt, perhaps recognizing my face from the local headlines. I was no longer a patient. I was a living story of scandal and punishment. And the ironic thing was that for the first time in months, no one insulted me. The external hatred had turned into oblivion, and oblivion, though less noisy, hurt more. At night, when the hospital fell silent, I'd stare at the ceiling. My body lay motionless, my arm hanging limp, and my mind couldn't escape the past. I thought of Daniel. I knew. Had he seen any news? Was he with Carla, happy, starting a new life while I rotted in regret? Sometimes I'd imagine him arriving, approaching the bed, taking my hand, and telling me he forgave me. But that never happened. After a few weeks, the doctors decided to discharge me. You can continue the treatment at home. With help, they said. But what home? Daniel had sold the property and I no longer had a job, no money, no family willing to take me in. A distant cousin, Clara, the daughter of an aunt I barely spoke to, showed up. She took me to a small apartment on the outskirts out of pity, maybe out of obligation. There, in a cramped, damp room, I began my new life, the life of a woman who is already dead, but who continues to breathe by mistake. The recovery was slow and painful. Physical therapy, medication, tests. Every movement was a battle. Sometimes I'd scream in frustration, but my voice was too weak for anyone to hear. The body I once used to teach, to seduce, was now a prison. I depended on Clara for everything. Eating, bathing, changing clothes. The shame of needing help was as great as the shame of the past. And in many moments I thought maybe it would have been better not to wake up, but fate, cruel as always, didn't grant me that relief. I was condemned to continue. Alive, yes, but unable to live. Life after the fall isn't life. It's a prolonged survival, made of small gestures that cost entire worlds. Every morning began with Clara opening the curtains, arranging my pillows, and asking if I wanted coffee. I'd respond with difficulty, slurring the words in a hoarse voice. Seeing the exhaustion in her eyes was a daily reminder of my condition. I had become a weight, a burden, a dependent shadow. And what hurt the most wasn't the physical limitation, but the silence. That silence that was once a choice, now a punishment. I spent the first few months trying to understand what was left of me. Physical therapy was painful and humiliating. My body wouldn't respond. My left hand trembled, I dragged my leg, I struggled to speak. Every attempt at rehabilitation was a cruel reminder of how much I had wasted. The body that had once supported me, that I proudly displayed in class and that had served as my weapon and shield, was now just a reminder of everything I had lost. The mirror, that old accomplice, had become an enemy. I avoided looking at myself because what I saw wasn't just deformity, but consequences. From time to time, I'd hear Clara talking on the phone with her mother. She got worse today, she'd say in a low voice. I don't think she'll ever walk properly again. Sometimes I'd cry in secret, even though I knew crying wouldn't change anything. She was kind, but distant. She took care of me like someone tending to an incurable wound, with patience, but without hope. And I understood. I didn't expect affection or love. I just hoped time would pass without more pain. Social media, newspapers, gossip, everything erased me. No one talked about Lucia, the woman from the scandal, anymore. And paradoxically, being forgotten was crueler than being hated. Because when the world hates you, at least it still sees you, but when it forgets you, it's as if you never existed. Sometimes I'd pick up my old phone, the one that survived the fall, and go through my contacts. They were all silenced, deleted, inactive. Daniel was still there with the picture I had taken of him on the beach. Smiling in a way I never saw again, I thought about calling him countless times. I wrote long, regretful messages and then deleted them all. What right did I have to interrupt his life again? I had heard rumors that he had married Carla, that they had a child, that they had moved to Querétaro. I didn't know if it was true, but I silently imagined it. And as painful as it was to accept, a part of me felt relieved. Someone had to be happy in this story, and I no longer had the strength to be it. Sometimes Clara would turn on the radio in the late afternoon and old songs would fill the small room. I'd close my eyes and see flashes of the past. Daniel cooking clumsily, Diego looking at me in class, Javier holding my back, the laughter on trips, the hidden tears. It was like watching a movie I didn't want to see, but couldn't turn off. Regret didn't come in waves, but in tides. Endless. And the worst part was that even after everything I was still trying to understand why I started, why I continued, why I let guilt become routine, and the answer never came, maybe because there was no answer. In the few moments of emotional lucidity I'd write. Clara bought me a notebook and a thick pen so I could practice my coordination. Instead, I started writing down memories. I wrote slowly, with crooked letters and visible effort. Every sentence was an exercise in pain. I betrayed out of need, I continued out of fear, I fell because of pride. Sometimes I'd read them out loud and the sound of the words felt strange, as if they weren't mine. It was my way of atoning for my sins before a God who had perhaps already given up. The doctor's visits became infrequent. The diagnosis was the same, no significant improvement. Little by little I stopped trying to progress. I began to accept the immobility as part of me. The wheelchair, the assisted bathing, the controlled feeding, it all became routine. One day, Clara asked if I wanted to walk again, and I nodded wearily. What for? I mumbled with effort. To go where? At night, when the house was asleep, I'd stay awake listening to the distant sounds of the city. I'd wonder how many people passed by me without knowing I existed. How many women might be making the same mistakes, believing they could control the fire before it consumed everything. I wanted to scream at them, to warn them it wasn't worth it, that there was no pleasure that could compensate for regret, but my voice broke and the world didn't hear me, and so I resigned myself. I learned to breathe without hope, to exist without purpose. The body survives, but the soul has already fallen to the ground, along with the fragments of the woman I once was. The days now pass slowly, almost shapelessly. There's no difference between Monday and Sunday, morning or night. The light coming through the window is the same every day, pale, indifferent, as if it has stopped illuminating. I've learned to measure time not by hours, but by the sounds of routine, the sound of the door when Clara leaves for work, the clinking of dishes when she returns, the sound of the television that keeps me company while my body remains motionless. Sometimes I think the greatest punishment wasn't losing Daniel, or my body, or my reputation. It was surviving long enough to understand everything I've caused. Regret is a kind of prison without bars. It's in every memory, in every gesture I can no longer undo. I spend hours staring at the ceiling, remembering Daniel's face, the words I never said, the ones I said too late. Sometimes I dream of him. In the dream he enters the room, sits beside me, and takes my hand. I try to apologize, but my voice doesn't work. He just looks at me with that serene sadness he always had and says, "Now you understand." And then he disappears. When I wake up, there are tears on the pillow and the same emptiness as always. I don't know if he thinks of me. Maybe once in a while he hears a song we used to like or passes by a place we used to frequent. But I think most of the time I no longer exist for him, and it's fair. I did irreparable damage to him, and deep down what tortures me the most is knowing that if I had waited, talked, and faced the silence differently, maybe things would have been different. But the rush to be loved made me lose the only true love I've ever had. Sometimes Clara asks if I regret it. I laugh. A silent, joyless laugh. Regret is all I am now. It's in my body, in my twisted hands, in the words that come out slowly. It's the air I breathe, and yet it doesn't absolve me, because regret doesn't bring forgiveness, only awareness. And awareness, when it comes late, is just a sharp blade. I recently started writing again, even with the struggle in my hands. In my notebook, I try to leave something meaningful, maybe a testimony, maybe an apology the world will never read. I write short, powerful sentences. Desire becomes a prison. A lie never ends where it begins. There is no freedom without truth. Every word hurts, but it's the only way I've found not to go crazy. Clara sometimes reads over my shoulder and remains silent. I think she feels sorry for me, and I don't blame her. Deep down, I also feel sorry for the woman I was. At the hospital, the doctors said I might regain some mobility over time. That was over a year ago, and time has brought nothing. My body remains motionless, my left side dead. What still moves, ironically, is my right side, the one that writes, the one that remembers, the one that feels. And maybe this is the ultimate punishment, to be able to record my own ruin with the hand I have left. From time to time I think about God, not with hope for salvation, but with a mix of fear and longing. Has He forgiven me? Is He watching me now, seeing this deformed version of me, trying to understand what's left of my soul, or has he forgotten me like the rest of the world? I don't know. Maybe the punishment is just to live, to remember, and to never be able to change anything. There are days when Clara sits with me on the porch and shows me the sky. Look, Lucia, the sunset is beautiful today. I smile slightly, even if I don't feel it. The sky is beautiful, yes, but for me it no longer has color. Everything is pale, as if life has lost its tone. Still, I give thanks in silence, not for being alive, but for finally understanding. I know many would say I deserved it, and maybe they're right, but what no one understands is that the real punishment wasn't what the world did to me, but what I did to myself. I betrayed those who loved me, I lost what defined me, and now I pay the price of conscience. I no longer dream of new beginnings or forgiveness. I just wait for the day when my tired body decides to join my soul and rest once and for all. Until then, I remain here, still, in silence, remembering. I'm Lucia, the woman who confused freedom with escape, love with validation, pleasure with comfort. The woman who destroyed everything she touched and survived only to witness her own end. And maybe, deep down, this is the cruelest form of justice.